There are some kinds of loneliness in life that arrive long before anyone actually leaves. They settle quietly into the empty spaces of ordinary days, into untouched coffee cups, quiet hallways, and unanswered phone calls. Sometimes, the people we love most drift away so slowly, we don't even realize we're grieving them until the silence has already become part of the house. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 76 years old, and for most of my life, I lived in a small white house near Cedar Hill Church in Asheville, North Carolina. It wasn't a grand home. The paint on the porch railings had begun peeling years ago. The kitchen floor creaked near the refrigerator. And every winter, cold air slipped through the old living room windows, no matter how many blankets I tucked around them. But to me, that house held an entire lifetime. Love, loss, prayer, family dinners, and memories that still lived quietly inside the walls long after the people themselves had changed. The house sat near the edge of a quiet neighborhood lined with maple trees. Every Sunday morning, the church bells from Cedar Hill Baptist rang softly through the streets. For years, those bells marked the rhythm of my life. They rang the morning I married my husband Thomas. They rang the day we dedicated our son, Ethan, to the Lord as a baby. And many years later, they rang the afternoon we buried Thomas beneath a gray autumn sky. Life has a way of tying joy and sorrow together sometimes. That's something age teaches you slowly. Thomas and I were married for 43 years. He was a quiet man, steady, gentle, the kind of husband who fixed broken cabinet doors without being asked, and prayed quietly beside the bed every night before sleep. Even during difficult seasons, he carried peace into our home, especially after Ethan was born. I still remember bringing our son home from the hospital. Thomas stood in the nursery doorway holding that tiny little bundle, smiling with tears in his eyes, and softly he whispered, "We've been trusted with something precious." He was right. Children completely change the atmosphere of a home. Suddenly, every room carries life differently. Tiny footsteps in the hallway, laughter from the kitchen, crayon drawings taped crookedly onto the refrigerator, and somehow, even exhaustion feels holy when love lives inside it. Ethan was a sweet child, sensitive-hearted, the kind of little boy who cried during sad church movies and brought home injured birds he thought needed saving. Every evening after dinner, he sat beside me at the kitchen table while I washed dishes, talking about school, friends, dreams. Sometimes, he talked so much, I barely managed to finish cleaning before bedtime. But truthfully, I loved every minute of it. Back then, I never imagined silence could one day replace all those conversations. One autumn evening, when Ethan was around 10 years old, we sat together on the front porch while rain fell softly across the neighborhood. He leaned his head against my shoulder and asked quietly, "Mom, do people ever stop meeting their mothers?" I laughed softly at the question. "I don't think so," I answered. "Not completely." He nodded thoughtfully. "Good," he whispered. Then, after a pause, "Because I don't think I'd know what to do without you." Those words stayed tucked inside my heart for years, especially later, when life began changing him in ways neither of us expected. Thomas passed away when Ethan was 19. A heart attack. Sudden. Cruel. One ordinary Tuesday morning, life simply became divided into before and after. The grief inside that house after the funeral felt unbearable. Every room carried reminders of him. His reading glasses are beside the recliner. His coffee mug was still resting in the cabinet. The faint smell of his aftershave lingered in the bathroom. For weeks, I moved through the house like someone walking through water. Slowly, quietly, trying to understand how the world continued moving after such a loss. And during those first painful months, it was Ethan who kept me going. He sat with me at night while we drank tea in silence. He prayed with me before church. Sometimes, he simply hugged me without saying anything at all. That's the thing about grief. Sometimes, presence matters more than words. One evening, not long after Thomas passed, I found Ethan sitting alone at the kitchen table late at night. The house was dark, except for the small light above the stove. He looked up at me quietly and asked, "Mom, are you scared?" I sat beside him slowly. "Yes," I admitted softly. He nodded as he understood already. Then, after a moment, he reached across the table and held my hand. "I'll take care of you now," he whispered. I almost cried hearing that, because grief had made him grow older overnight. And truthfully, part of me leaned on that promise more than I should have. The years after Thomas died became simpler, not easier, just quieter. Ethan attended a nearby community college while working part-time at a hardware store downtown. And, for a while, life still felt close between us. Every Sunday morning, we sat together at Cedar Hill Baptist Church, same pew every week. After service, we'd stop at Miller's Diner for pancakes and coffee. Those little routines became sacred to me, because ordinary moments often become the memories people miss most later. As Ethan entered adulthood, I began noticing subtle changes. Nothing dramatic, just small shifts. More time spent away from home, more private phone calls, more evenings where he seemed distracted while sitting across from me at dinner. At first, I told myself it was natural. Children grow up. That's what they're supposed to do. But motherhood carries strange contradictions. You spend years teaching your child how to stand on their own, while quietly praying they never stop turning back emotionally toward home. One spring afternoon, Ethan came home smiling wider than I'd seen in months. "I got the job in Chicago," he announced. I froze for a moment while drying dishes at the sink. Chicago, so far away from Asheville. So far away from Cedar Hill Church and the little white house where our whole life had unfolded. But I smiled anyway. Because real love learns how to celebrate even while grieving quietly inside. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I whispered. And truthfully, part of me really meant it. That night, after Ethan went upstairs, I sat alone on the porch listening to crickets beneath the warm Carolina sky. The porch swing moved gently beneath me, and quietly I prayed, "Lord, help me release my son without making him feel guilty for growing." That prayer would become part of my life for many years afterward. Because sometimes, love requires letting people go, even while your heart begs them to stay close. Looking back now, I think that was the beginning of everything changing between Ethan and me. Not through conflict, not through anger, just distance arriving quietly before either of us fully recognized it. And back then, sitting alone on that porch swing beside the White House near Cedar Hill Church, I still believed, no matter how far life carried my son, home would always remain close to his heart. I didn't realize that one day, the silence inside that house, it would become louder than the church bells outside. At first, I thought distance was simply part of watching a child grow older, a natural season of life. But I didn't yet understand that somewhere between Asheville and Chicago, my son and I had already begun slowly losing the closeness we once thought could never fade. There are certain seasons in life that feel ordinary while you're living them. Simple days, simple routine, nothing dramatic. And yet later, when the house grows quiet, those ordinary moments become the ones your heart misses most. That's how I remember Ethan's younger years. Not through grand events, but through small things. The sound of his laughter drifted through the hallway. The way he hummed softly while doing homework. The little habit he had of sitting beside me every evening, no matter how busy life became. Back then, our home still felt full, not because we had wealth, we didn't, but because closeness filled spaces money never could. Every evening after dinner, Ethan pulled his chair beside me at the kitchen table while I cleaned up. Sometimes he talked nonstop. Other nights, he simply sat there quietly while I folded laundry or sorted mail. But somehow, his presence always made the house feel warmer. One evening, when Ethan was around 12, I remember him walking into the kitchen, carrying a school paper. His shoulders looked heavy. Something wrong? I asked gently. He hesitated for a moment before sitting down. I got picked last in gym again, he admitted softly. My heart tightened hearing that, because sensitive children carry embarrassment deeply. I sat beside him carefully. You know something important? I whispered. He looked up slowly. The people who matter most in life are usually the gentle ones. He frowned slightly. That doesn't make people stop being mean. No, I admitted softly, but it keeps you from becoming mean too. He sat quietly thinking about that. Then finally, he smiled just a little, and moments like that became the foundation of our relationship. Not perfection, just trust. The kind of trust built through everyday tenderness. Sunday mornings were always special in our house. Thomas would wake before sunrise and make coffee, while gospel music played softly on the radio. I still remember Ethan stumbling sleepily into the kitchen, wearing wrinkled church clothes, trying to finish toast before we left for Cedar Hill Baptist. Some mornings, he complained about wearing ties. Thomas would laugh quietly and say, "One day you'll miss these Sundays." Back then, none of us believed how true those words would become. After church, we almost always stopped at Miller's Diner. Same booth near the window. Pancakes for Ethan, black coffee for Thomas, and me, usually ordering soup no matter the season. Looking back now, those little routines feel sacred somehow, because ordinary love becomes extraordinary after time takes it away. As Ethan entered high school, our conversations deepened. Late at night, after homework and dinner, he often sat beside me on the front porch swing. The neighborhood would grow quiet around us. Street lights glowing softly through the trees, crickets humming in the distance. And somehow, that's when Ethan talked most honestly. One summer evening, he asked quietly, "Mom, do you think people can change completely?" I looked over at him carefully. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Like, become someone totally different from who they used to be." I thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "I think life changes people," I said softly. "But deep down, something true usually stays." He nodded thoughtfully. Then, after a pause, "I hope I always stay kind." That sentence stayed with me for years. Because kindness mattered deeply to Ethan back then, he noticed lonely people, defended classmates who got teased. Once, he even spent an entire weekend helping an elderly neighbor repair her fence after a storm. Not because anyone told him to, just because compassion came naturally to him. That's why later, when distance slowly grew between us, part of me struggled to understand it. Because coldness never belonged to my son naturally. One autumn afternoon during Ethan's senior year, I found him sitting quietly at the kitchen table, staring at college brochures. The house smelled like cinnamon from a pie cooling near the window, and sunlight stretched warmly across the floor. "You thinking about the future?" I asked gently. He smiled faintly. "Trying to." Then, after a pause, he looked at me seriously. "Mom, are you going to be all right if I move away someday?" The question caught me off guard. Not because I hadn't thought about it, but because suddenly, the possibility felt real. I sat across from him slowly. "Parents raise children to build lives of their own," I said softly. "Yes, but are you going to be all right?" I smiled gently. "I'll miss you terribly." He laughed quietly. "But I'll survive." Truthfully, I wasn't fully sure that was true. Not emotionally. But love sometimes requires courage. Children are too young to recognize yet. That night, after Ethan went upstairs, I stood alone in his bedroom doorway for a long time. The walls are still covered with baseball posters. Books were scattered beside the bed. And suddenly, I realized how quickly life was moving. Children spend years needing you constantly. Then one day, without warning, you realize they're already halfway toward becoming someone the world will eventually claim for itself. Thomas noticed my sadness sometimes during those years. One evening, while we washed dishes together, he smiled softly and said, "You know, letting children grow is part of loving them too." I nodded quietly. I know. But understanding something and emotionally accepting it, they are very different things. Then came the hardest season of all, Thomas's death. After losing him, the bond between Ethan and me deepened even more for a while. Grief tied us together in quiet ways. Some nights, we sat together in the living room, saying almost nothing at all. The television was playing softly in the background, while sorrow-filled spaces words couldn't reach. One night, months after the funeral, Ethan looked over at me suddenly and whispered, "I'm scared you'll feel alone after I leave someday." That sentence broke my heart. Because children often carry guilt they were never meant to hold. I reached for his hand gently. "Your job isn't to stop living because I'm your mother," I told him softly. "But I don't want you lonely." I smiled through tears. "Loneliness comes and goes in life, sweetheart." Then quietly I added, "But love stays, even through distance." Back then, I truly believed that, and maybe, in some ways, it was still true. I didn't understand yet how painful emotional distance can become when silence slowly replaces closeness. The day Ethan left for Chicago, the whole house felt unsettled. Suitcases near the front door, coffee growing cold in untouched mugs. I remember standing beside his car in the driveway, trying not to cry while giving final instructions. Mothers always give. "Don't skip meals. Drive carefully. Call me when you arrive." He laughed softly. "Mom, I'm not disappearing." Then suddenly, he hugged me tightly. The kind of hug children give right before life changes permanently. "I'll always come home," he whispered. I closed my eyes, hearing those words, because deep inside, I needed to believe them. I watched his car disappear slowly down Magnolia Street that morning. Then, I walked back inside the White House near Cedar Hill Church, and for the very first time, it no longer felt full. The silence inside those rooms startled me. No music from upstairs, no footsteps in the hallway, just stillness. I stood alone in the kitchen for several moments, holding his empty coffee mug in my hands, and quietly, I prayed, "Lord, please watch over my boy." That prayer became part of my daily life after he left. Every morning, every night. Because motherhood never truly stops worrying, even after children grow older. Looking back now, I think that was the beginning of my long season of waiting. Waiting for calls. Waiting for visits. Waiting for the closeness we once carried so naturally. And at the time, I still believed distance would only strengthen our appreciation for each other. I didn't yet realize that sometimes people slowly outgrow the emotional language of home without even noticing it themselves. At first, Ethan called almost every evening after moving to Chicago, and hearing his voice still made the house feel alive again. But I didn't yet understand that somewhere between work, ambition, and adulthood, the little boy who once told me everything, he was slowly learning how to carry his life without reaching for mine first anymore. At first, the distance between Ethan and me didn't feel frightening. It simply felt temporary. The normal kind of separation that happens when children grow older, move away, and begin building lives of their own. That's what I kept telling myself anyway. The first few months after Ethan moved to Chicago, he called often, almost every evening, sometimes while walking home from work, sometimes while heating frozen dinners in his apartment kitchen. And every time the phone rang, the house seemed to wake up again. I would stop whatever I was doing, wipe my hands on a dish towel, and smile before answering. "Hi, sweetheart." "Hey, Mom." Even hearing those simple words brought comfort back into the rooms. One evening, while rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows, Ethan called, sounding unusually excited. "You're never gonna believe this," he laughed. "What happened?" "I finally got promoted." I smiled immediately. "Oh, Ethan, that's wonderful." I could hear pride and relief tangled together in his voice. And truthfully, I was proud too. Because after losing Thomas, I had prayed constantly that our son would build a stable life for himself. A peaceful life. The kind of life where struggle wouldn't follow him the way grief once had. That night, we talked for nearly an hour about his office, the people he worked with, the little coffee shop near his apartment where he stopped every morning. And after hanging up, I sat quietly at the kitchen table, smiling to myself. Because even from hundreds of miles away, my son still felt emotionally close then. But life changes slowly, quietly. So quietly, you often don't recognize it while it's happening. The first thing that changed was timing. Instead of evening calls, days began passing between conversations. Then, eventually, weeks. At first, I tried not to think too much about it. People become busy. Careers demand attention. Adult life moves fast. I understood all of that. At least, I tried to. One Friday evening, I baked Ethan's favorite peach cobbler out of habit. The smell filled the kitchen instantly, warm cinnamon and butter drifting through the house. And suddenly, I realized there was no one coming home to eat it anymore. That realization sounds small, but loneliness often arrives through ordinary moments like that. Quiet reminders that life has shifted while you were still emotionally standing in the old version of it. That night, I wrapped slices carefully in foil and carried some next door to my neighbor, Mrs. Grayson. She smiled warmly when she opened the door. "You always make too much food," she teased gently. I laughed softly. Old habits. But walking back into my empty kitchen afterward, I suddenly understood something painful. Cooking had never really been about food. It had always been about caring for someone. And now, there was no one left inside the house to care for in those same daily ways. A few weeks later, Ethan called while I was folding laundry in the living room. But this conversation felt different immediately. Not cold, just distracted. "Sorry I haven't called much," he said quickly. "Work's been crazy." I nodded quietly, even though he couldn't see me. "I understand." And truthfully, part of me did. But another part of me noticed something else. The conversation felt rushed, almost like he was trying to complete a responsibility rather than reach for connection. Still, I ignored the feeling, because mothers often protect themselves with hope longer than they should. One Sunday after church, Pastor Miller stopped me near the parking lot. "How's Ethan enjoying Chicago?" he asked kindly. I smiled automatically. "Oh, he's doing very well." And that was true, at least outwardly. But while driving home afterward, I realized something quietly. I had started giving people updates about Ethan's life, without actually knowing much about his heart anymore. That frightened me more than I wanted to admit. The following Christmas, Ethan came home for only 3 days. 3 very short days. I cleaned the house for nearly a week before he arrived. Fresh sheets on the guest bed. His favorite coffee is stocked in the cabinet. I even bought the peppermint cookies he loved as a teenager. And when I heard his car pull into the driveway, my heart lifted exactly the way it always had. But something felt different once he walked through the front door. Older, somehow. Not physically, emotionally. He hugged me warmly enough, but part of his attention always seemed elsewhere. Checking his phone, answering emails, glancing at the clock. One evening, while we sat near the fireplace, I asked softly, "Are you happy, Ethan?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He looked up slowly. "Yeah, I think so." "Think so." Such uncertain words. I studied his face quietly. "You don't sound convinced." He laughed softly. "I'm just tired, Mom." And maybe that was true. But mothers notice when exhaustion lives deeper than sleep can fix. The next morning, I found him standing alone in the kitchen, staring out the window before sunrise. The room glowed softly beneath the stove light. For a moment, he looked strangely lonely standing there, even inside his childhood home. "You're up early," I said gently. He smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep." I poured coffee into 2 mugs and sat beside him at the table. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then, quietly, he asked, "Do you ever feel like life moves too fast to keep up with?" The sadness in his voice startled me. I looked at him carefully. "All the time," I admitted softly. He stared down into his coffee. "Sometimes, I feel like I'm becoming someone I don't fully recognize." That sentence stayed with me long after Christmas ended. Because beneath all his success, I suddenly sensed something unsettled growing inside him. And somehow, the emotional distance between us began making more sense. Not because he loved me less, but because people struggling inside themselves often stop knowing how to stay emotionally close to others too. After returning to Chicago, Ethan called less often again. And when he did, our conversations became simpler. Surface level. How's work? Busy. How are you feeling? Tired mostly. No deep conversations anymore. No vulnerable moments. Just updates. One evening, after another short phone call, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after the line went silent. The clock ticked softly above the stove, and suddenly, I realized I had begun rationing my loneliness, telling myself little things like, at least he still calls sometimes, at least he's healthy, at least he's building a good life. But deep down, I missed my son, not physically, emotionally. I missed the boy who once sat beside me every evening, telling me every thought inside his heart. One rainy afternoon, I opened an old photo album while cleaning the living room shelves. Pictures spilled gently across the table. Birthday parties, church picnics, family vacations. There was one photo of Ethan, around age 15, smiling beside Thomas on a fishing dock. Both of them are laughing at something outside the frame. I touched the picture softly. And suddenly, grief washed over me in a way I hadn't expected. Not only grief for Thomas, but grief for closeness itself, because relationships do not always disappear dramatically. Sometimes, they fade quietly beneath the weight of time, distance, and unspoken things. That evening, I sat alone on the porch swing, watching rain fall across Magnolia Street. The church bells from Cedar Hill rang softly in the distance, and quietly, I whispered a prayer. Lord, please don't let distance harden either of our hearts. The wind moved gently through the trees while I prayed, and for some reason, I suddenly felt afraid, not of losing my son completely, but of becoming someone he only remembered checking on occasionally. Looking back now, I think that was the season when silence truly began to replace closeness between us. Not through cruelty, not through rejection, just emotional drift. The slow kind, the kind people barely notice until years have already passed. And at the time, I still believed things would eventually return to normal. I didn't yet realize that another person was about to enter Ethan's life and quietly change the space I once held inside his heart forever. At first, I blamed busy schedules and adulthood for the growing distance between us. But I didn't yet understand that soon, a woman named Claire would enter my son's life. And from that moment forward, home would never quite feel the same to him again. There are certain kinds of pain that mothers learn to carry quietly, not because the hurt disappears, but because after a while, you begin realizing some truths feel too heavy to place in your child's hands, especially when they are already busy carrying the weight of their own lives. That's what happened to me with Ethan. Little by little, I began learning which feelings to swallow before speaking, which disappointments to hide behind kindness, which tears to wipe away before answering the phone. Because motherhood changes as children grow older. When they are young, they come running toward your comfort. But once they become adults, a mother often becomes the one quietly protecting them from her own loneliness instead. By the time Ethan and Claire had been together nearly 2 years, our relationship had changed in ways I struggled to explain even to myself. Nothing dramatic had happened. No argument. No betrayal. Just distance. Slow, emotional distance. The kind that grows quietly between phone calls, between missed holidays, between conversations that never go deep anymore. One evening, I called Ethan after dinner. The kitchen smelled faintly of chicken soup and rosemary. Rain tapped softly against the windows, and the old clock above the stove ticked louder than usual in the silence. When Ethan answered, his voice sounded rushed immediately. "Hey, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart." I smiled softly while wrapping the phone cord around my fingers. "How are things?" "Busy." That word again. Busy. I had begun hearing it so often, it almost felt like another person living between us. We spoke for only a few minutes before Claire called for him in the background. "I should go," he said quickly, and suddenly, before I could stop myself, the words slipped out quietly. "I miss you." Silence followed for half a second. Not long, but long enough for my heart to notice it. "I miss you too, Mom," he answered politely. Politely. Not deeply. Not emotionally. Just politely. Then the call ended. I sat alone at the kitchen table afterward, staring at the darkened phone in my hand. And quietly, I realized something painful. There's a difference between someone loving you and someone having room for you emotionally anymore. That realization settled heavily inside me. Not bitterness, just sadness. One Sunday afternoon, after church service, I drove home beneath soft gray skies. The neighborhood looked peaceful, children riding bicycles. Wind is moving gently through the maple trees. And suddenly, I felt tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Not physically, emotionally, because loneliness wears people down slowly, especially the quiet kind no one else fully sees. That evening, I opened the hall closet looking for an old photo album. Instead, I found a box of Ethan's childhood school papers tied neatly with faded blue ribbon. I carried it into the living room and sat quietly beside the lamp. Inside were drawings, report cards, little handwritten notes from elementary school. One crumpled paper caught my attention immediately. Across the top, in uneven, boyish handwriting, were the words, "My Mom." I smiled softly as I unfolded it carefully. "My mom makes me feel safe when I'm scared," it read. Another line said, "She listens even when I talk too much." I laughed quietly through tears reading that, because once upon a time, my son had felt emotionally safest beside me. And now, sometimes our conversations felt like obligations squeezed between meetings and schedules. That night, I cried for the first time in months. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly there in the lamplight, while old memories rested in my lap. Afterward, I knelt beside the couch and prayed softly. "Lord, help me love my son without making him responsible for my loneliness." That prayer became important to me because I never wanted Ethan to feel trapped between his life and my emotions. So instead, I began learning silence. The silence mothers often carry when they realize speaking honestly may only create guilt. One Thanksgiving, Ethan and Claire canceled their visit only 2 days before arriving. "We're exhausted," Ethan explained over the phone. "Work's been overwhelming." I stood quietly in the kitchen while listening. The turkey had already been thawing in the refrigerator. Fresh flowers sat on the dining table. And upstairs, the guest room had already been prepared carefully. Still, I smiled gently into the phone. "I understand, sweetheart." And truthfully, part of me did. But another part of me quietly broke that afternoon. After hanging up, I walked slowly through the house, turning off unnecessary lights one by one. The dining room suddenly felt too large, too empty. I stood beside the table for several moments, staring at the untouched place settings. Then finally, I sat down alone. The silence inside the house felt enormous. That evening, instead of eating Thanksgiving dinner properly, I carried a small bowl of soup into the living room and sat beside the fireplace. Soft piano hymns played quietly from the radio, and while the fire crackled gently beside me, I whispered something aloud for the first time. "I don't know how to reach him anymore." Hearing those words spoken aloud made the loneliness feel suddenly real. Because mothers spend years believing love alone can maintain closeness forever. But adulthood complicates people. Responsibilities shift them. Relationships reshape them. And sometimes, without meaning to, children slowly stop noticing the emotional spaces their absence creates. A few weeks later, I began writing letters. Not to send, to release thoughts I no longer knew how to speak aloud. The first letter started, "Dear Ethan, today I missed you more than usual." That was all. But somehow, writing it eased something inside me, so I kept going. I wrote about ordinary things. Church, on Sundays. The roses are blooming beside the porch. How quiet the house felt during rainstorms now. Sometimes I wrote memories. The time he fell asleep beside Thomas during a fishing trip. On Christmas morning, he cried over a broken toy truck. The porch swing conversations after his father died. And sometimes I wrote truths too painful to say directly. "I worry you've forgotten how deeply you're loved here." Or, "I hope success never costs you tenderness." I folded each letter carefully afterward and placed them inside a wooden box beneath my bed. Unscented, unread, private. Not because Ethan didn't deserve honesty, but because motherhood often teaches women to protect their children, even from the sadness they themselves created. One winter evening, Claire called me unexpectedly. Her voice sounded warm enough. Polite, but careful. "We've both just been under pressure lately," she explained. "I hope you know, Ethan still cares about you very much." I smiled softly while holding the phone. "I know, and I truly believe that." That was the painful part. I never doubted my son loved me. I began realizing love can exist even while emotional closeness fades. After the call ended, I stood quietly at the kitchen sink, watching snow drift gently outside. And suddenly, I understood something many mothers never say aloud. Sometimes, the deepest heartbreak is not rejection. It's becoming emotionally unnecessary to someone you once meant everything to. That realization changed me slowly, made me quieter, softer somehow. Not bitter, just careful. I I stopped mentioning how empty holidays felt, stopped talking about loneliness, stopped asking when Ethan would visit again, because eventually, a mother learns that some sorrows are better carried privately with God than spoken repeatedly into silence. Still, every evening before bed, I prayed for my son. Every single night, Lord, keep Ethan kind, keep his heart soft, and please remind him he still has a home here. Looking back now, I think those years completely changed my understanding of love. Because real love isn't only closeness. Sometimes it's quite patient, quiet waiting, quiet grace. And at the time, I still believed there would be enough time someday for honesty between us. I didn't yet realize that one Christmas would finally break something inside me completely and led me to write the most important letter of my entire life. I thought learning to be silent was the hardest part of motherhood, but I didn't yet know that one empty chair beside my fireplace would become the moment I finally understood. Some distances grow so quietly, you don't notice the heartbreak until the house stops feeling like home at all. There are certain holidays in life that stop feeling joyful long before the decorations come down. Not because the season changes, but because someone's absence quietly changes the meaning of the room itself. That Christmas, the house felt different from the very beginning, colder somehow, not physically, emotionally. I started decorating the little white house near Cedar Hill Church the week after Thanksgiving, just like I always had. The same old ornaments, the same hand-stitched stockings, and the same nativity set Thomas and I bought during our second year of marriage. Every piece carried memory. I moved slowly through the living room, hanging lights across the fireplace mantel, while soft hymns played quietly on the radio. Outside, snow drifted gently across Asheville. And for a few moments, the house almost felt warm again. Hopeful, because Ethan had promised he was coming home for Christmas. Not maybe, not we'll see. A real promise. "I'll be there this year, Mom," he told me over the phone weeks earlier. And hearing those words did something tender inside my heart. I tried not to sound too emotional when he said it, but after we hung up, I sat quietly at the kitchen table, smiling through tears. Because no matter how old children become, a mother's heart still lights up at the thought of them coming home. For the next several weeks, I prepared carefully. I washed the guest room curtains twice, bought fresh cinnamon candles for the hallway. At the grocery store, I filled the cart with Ethan's favorite foods without even thinking. Honey-baked ham, sweet potato casserole, peppermint coffee creamer he used to love during college breaks. The cashier smiled while scanning everything. "Big family Christmas?" she asked warmly. I smiled softly. My son's coming home. Even saying those words aloud made me happy. That's the thing about hope. It softens loneliness for a little while. Christmas Eve arrived cold and quiet. Snow covered the sidewalks outside Cedar Hill Church, and the church bells echoed softly through the neighborhood as evening settled in. I spent most of the afternoon cooking. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon, butter, and roasted turkey. For the first time in months, the house felt alive again, almost expectant. I remember pausing several times while cooking, simply imagining Ethan walking through the front door. He took off his coat, laughing softly, saying, "It smells the same in here." That thought alone nearly brought tears to my eyes. Around 4 o'clock, I set the dining room table carefully. 3 plates, 3 glasses. 3 cloth napkins were folded neatly beside each setting. 1 chair at the far side of the table remained empty for Thomas. I still left it there during the holidays. Not because I couldn't let go, but because love leaves echoes in places people once filled faithfully. The snow outside had begun falling harder by evening. Street lights glowed softly through the windows, while Christmas music drifted quietly from the radio. And every few minutes I glanced toward the driveway, waiting. At 6:30, my phone rang. My heart jumped immediately. I answered, smiling. "Hi, sweetheart." But something in Ethan's silence told me instantly something was wrong. "Mom," he said quietly. His voice sounded tense. "Careful." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter gently. "What happened?" A long pause followed. Then softly, "Claire and I aren't going to make it tonight." The words landed heavier than they should have. Not because plans changed, but because deep down, I already knew this wasn't simply about the weather. "What do you mean?" I asked gently. "The storm's getting worse," he explained quickly. "And honestly, we're both exhausted." Exhausted. That word again. The same word that had slowly become a wall between us for years. I looked toward the dining room table while he spoke. 3 untouched plates were waiting beneath soft Christmas lights. And suddenly, the house felt painfully still. "You could come tomorrow morning," I whispered carefully. Another pause. Then finally, "We actually decided we're just gonna stay in Chicago this year." Something inside my chest quietly cracked, hearing that. Not loudly, not dramatically, just softly enough that I knew life would never feel quite the same afterward. Still, I smiled into the phone anyway. "That's all right, sweetheart." And truthfully, part of me hated how easily mothers learn to hide heartbreak inside kindness. "I'm sorry," Ethan said quietly. "I know you worked hard getting everything ready." I stared at the untouched table again. The candles are already lit. The food is still warm in the kitchen. And softly, I answered, "It's okay." But after we hung up, I stood alone in the dining room for a very long time. The Christmas tree glowed quietly in the corner. Snow continued falling outside, and there, in the middle of that beautiful room, one empty chair suddenly felt louder than every Christmas song playing softly nearby. I finally sat down at the table alone. 3 place settings are still untouched, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to admit something honestly. I wasn't only missing my son physically anymore. I was grieving the relationship we used to have emotionally. That realization hurt more than canceled plans ever could. I bowed my head quietly at the table, not even sure what prayer to say anymore. Then softly, through tears, I whispered, "Lord, please don't let my love become something he only remembers when it's convenient." The silence afterward felt enormous. The kind of silence that settles deep into old houses during winter nights. Eventually, I stood and slowly cleared the extra plates away, one by one. The sound of dishes clinking softly in the kitchen nearly broke me, because grief often hides inside ordinary motions. That night, instead of eating at the dining room table, I carried a small plate into the living room and sat beside the fireplace alone. The Christmas tree lights reflected softly across the windows, and beside the fireplace, the empty chair stayed untouched all evening. Thomas's chair, but somehow, that night, it no longer felt empty because of death. It felt empty because of the distance. And that realization wounded me deeply. Around midnight, I turned off the living room lights and sat quietly beside the tree for a little while longer. The whole house glowed softly in the darkness. And for some reason, I suddenly remembered Ethan at 5 years old, running down the hallway in footed pajamas on Christmas morning, laughing, excited, calling out, "Mom, wake up! It's Christmas!" I covered my face quietly then, because time can be cruel sometimes. It gives people beautiful memories, then leaves them sitting alone beside those memories years later. Before bed, I walked slowly into Ethan's old room upstairs. Everything still looked almost untouched. The bookshelf, the old baseball trophies, a faded photograph of him and Thomas was still pinned near the desk. I sat carefully on the edge of the bed and finally cried openly. Not angry tears, not bitter tears, just the quiet grief of a mother realizing her child no longer needs to be at home the way he once did. And that night, for the very first time, I began writing the letter. Not because I planned to send it, but because some pain becomes too heavy to keep carrying silently forever. I sat at the kitchen table beneath the soft stove light, opened a blank piece of paper, and slowly wrote, "Dear Ethan, there are things a mother learns not to say aloud." The words came easier after that, almost like my heart had been waiting years for permission to finally speak honestly. And looking back now, I think that Christmas changed me permanently. Not into someone harder, but into someone who finally understood. Love sometimes survives quietly inside grief, without ever being fully spoken. That Christmas night, I thought writing the letter would help ease my loneliness. I didn't yet know, those years later, my son would sit alone inside this same house, reading those words with tears in his eyes, wishing he had come home sooner. There are some nights in life when the silence inside a house becomes too heavy to ignore. Not angry silence, not dramatic silence, just the kind that settles quietly into your chest until even breathing feels emotional. That winter after Christmas, the little white house near Cedar Hill Church felt colder than usual. The decorations still hung around the living room for several days after the holiday ended. Not because I forgot to take them down, but because part of me wasn't ready to let go of the hope they had briefly carried into the house. The Christmas tree lights still glowed softly at night. The stockings still rested above the fireplace, and beside the armchair near the window, Thomas's old Bible remained exactly where he had left it years earlier. Sometimes, grief keeps people frozen in small ways. That January brought heavy snow to Asheville. Most mornings, I woke before sunrise and sat quietly at the kitchen table, wrapped in a sweater while coffee brewed nearby. The world outside looked still, peaceful even. But inside me, something felt unsettled. Because after enough years of emotional distance, loneliness stops feeling temporary. It begins feeling like part of your identity. One evening, snow drifted softly against the windows while I sat alone in the living room, listening to old gospel hymns on the radio. The house glowed gently beneath the lamplight, and for some reason, I suddenly thought about Ethan as a little boy again. 7 years old, curled beside Thomas on the couch, holding a children's Bible almost too large for his tiny hands. I remembered how seriously he used to listen during bedtime prayers, how carefully he folded his little hands together before whispering, "Amen." That memory hit my heart harder than I expected, because somewhere over the years, life had carried my son so far emotionally from those simple moments, not away from goodness, not away from love completely, just away from closeness. And sitting there alone that night, I realized I had spent years pretending not to feel abandoned by it. That realization frightened me, not because I blamed Ethan, but because honesty sometimes arrives suddenly after years of silence. I turned off the radio quietly then. The room became still, except for the soft crackling of the fireplace. And for the first time in a very long while, I let myself cry fully. Not politely, not quietly holding tears back the way mothers often do. Just honestly, the crying that comes from carrying too many unspoken feelings for too many years. I cried for Thomas, for the loneliness, for the empty holidays, for every phone call that ended too quickly. And most of all, I cried for the relationship Ethan and I used to have before life complicated it. After a while, I wiped my face slowly and walked toward the kitchen. The clock above the stove read nearly midnight. Outside, snow continued falling softly beneath the streetlights. And suddenly, without fully planning to, I pulled out a sheet of paper, then another, then a pen. I sat at the kitchen table quietly staring at the blank page for several minutes before writing anything at all. Because some truths feel frightening once they finally reach the surface. Then slowly, I began. Dear Ethan. Even writing his name made tears rise again. I paused, took a shaky breath, and continued. There are things a mother learns not to say aloud, because love sometimes chooses silence instead of becoming a burden. The words came slowly at first, carefully, but once my heart finally opened, the letter almost wrote itself. I wrote about missing him, not only his visits, but his presence, his honesty, his laughter, the version of him who once sat beside me every evening, talking about everything inside his heart. I wrote about the empty Christmas chair near the fireplace, about setting the table for people who never arrived, about hearing church bells on Sunday mornings and remembering the little boy who once sat beside me at Cedar Hill Baptist holding Thomas's hand. And between those memories, I wrote truths I had hidden from him for years. I know life became busy. I know adulthood changes people. But sometimes I wondered if you realized how quiet this house became after you stopped calling. Tears blurred the page several times while writing. Still, I kept going, not because I wanted Ethan to feel guilty. Never that, but because somewhere deep inside, I needed my son to understand that mothers feel absence too. Not with anger, with ache. I wrote for nearly 2 hours that night. The coffee beside me went cold, untouched. Snow piled softly against the windows outside. And by the end of the letter, my heart felt emotionally exhausted, but lighter somehow too. Toward the bottom of the final page, I wrote the hardest truth of all. You never stopped being loved here, Ethan, even during the years we slowly stopped knowing how to talk to each other. That sentence nearly undid me, because it was the truest thing I had written all night. Love had never disappeared between us. Only closeness had. And there is a difference. a painful one. When the letter was finally finished, I sat quietly rereading every page beneath the soft kitchen light. Part of me considered mailing it. For several long minutes, I truly thought about it. But then, fear settled into my chest. Not fear of rejection, fear of becoming emotionally weighed down. My son wouldn't know how to carry. So instead, I folded the pages carefully, very carefully. Then I walked into the living room and picked up the old brown family Bible resting beside Thomas's chair. The leather cover felt worn and familiar in my hands. That Bible had carried decades of our lives inside it. Birth certificates tucked between pages, prayer requests, funeral programs, and now, my unsent letter. I opened slowly to the book of Psalms, Thomas's favorite. Then, I gently slipped the folded pages inside. Right between Psalm 34 and Psalm 35. Afterward, I rested my hands softly over the closed Bible and whispered, "Lord, if Ethan ever reads these words someday, please let him understand my heart kindly." The house remained completely still around me afterward, but something inside me had shifted, not healed completely, just acknowledged. Sometimes, speaking truth privately before God is enough to soften pain a little. The following weeks passed quietly. I never mentioned the letter to Ethan, never hinted at it during our conversations, and truthfully, part of me assumed he would probably never see it. Life continued moving gently forward. Phone calls still came occasionally, brief visits every year or two. And every time Ethan left Asheville, I smiled warmly at the front door while quietly preparing myself for the silence that would follow afterward. That became my rhythm. Hope, brief closeness, distance again. Still, every night before bed, I prayed for him faithfully, not for success, not for achievement, but for softness. Lord, protect my son from becoming emotionally lost. That prayer mattered deeply to me because the world teaches people how to become accomplished, but not always how to remain tender. One rainy afternoon months later, I sat beside the living room window, reading scripture while thunder rolled softly outside. And suddenly, a strange thought crossed my mind. What if one day, after I'm gone, Ethan finally reads that letter? The idea unsettled me immediately. Not because I feared honesty, but because grief changes the meaning of words forever once someone can no longer answer them. I closed the Bible gently after that thought and quietly whispered, "I hope it never takes loss for my son to understand how deeply he's loved." Looking back now, I think chapter 6 was the beginning of my heart preparing for something I didn't yet fully recognize. Because sometimes, before life changes permanently, God places truths quietly into our hands first. And at the time, I still believed there would be enough years left for Ethan and me to repair what distance had weakened. I didn't yet realize that my health was already beginning to change quietly, and my son still believed there would always be more time. That night, I thought folding the letter inside the family Bible would keep my feelings hidden safely away. I didn't yet know that one day, my son would sit alone beside Thomas's old chair, holding those pages in trembling hands, wishing he had listened more carefully, while my voice was still here to answer him. There comes a season in many mothers' lives when they quietly begin hiding their pain instead of speaking it. Not because they want sympathy, and not because they don't trust their children, but because after spending a lifetime protecting the people they love, the instinct to shield them never really goes away. That's how it began for me, quietly. So quietly that at first, I even tried pretending nothing was changing. It started with small things, fatigue that lingered longer than usual, shortness of breath while climbing the porch steps, moments of dizziness I blamed on age. At 76, aches and exhaustion didn't seem unusual anymore, so I ignored them. At least, I tried to. One Sunday morning after church, I stood beside the kitchen counter, making tea, when suddenly the room tilted slightly beneath me. Just for a second. Enough to force me to grip the edge of the counter until the feeling passed. The kettle whistled softly nearby while I steadied my breathing, and for the first time, fear brushed quietly against my heart. Not fear of death exactly. At my age, you begin making peace with mortality in different ways. No. What frightened me most was the thought of becoming a burden, especially to Ethan. That afternoon, I scheduled a doctor's appointment without mentioning it to anyone. The clinic sat across town near Asheville Memorial Hospital. I remember sitting alone in the waiting room, watching rain slide slowly down the windows, while older couples held hands nearby. The room smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic, and suddenly, I felt very aware of how alone I had become. When Dr. Lewis finally entered the room, his expression carried that careful softness doctors use when they already know something patients are trying not to hear. He reviewed several test results quietly before looking up at me. "Margaret," he began gently, "I think we need to discuss your heart." Even now, I remember how suddenly the room felt still. The ticking clock on the wall, the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead, everything sharpened strangely for a moment. He explained things slowly. Congestive heart failure, medication adjustments, monitoring. Words that sounded clinical and distant at first, until one sentence settled fully inside me. You need to avoid unnecessary stress, and you shouldn't be alone too much. Alone too much. I almost smiled hearing that, because loneliness had already become part of my daily life long before any diagnosis arrived. Dr. Lewis studied me carefully over his glasses. "Does your son live nearby?" I hesitated only briefly. "No, he lives in Chicago." The doctor nodded slowly. "You should probably let him know what's going on." That suggestion tightened something inside my chest immediately. Not because Ethan wouldn't care. I knew he would. But because I also knew guilt lived heavily inside my son already, even when he rarely spoke about it. And somehow, I could not bear the thought of becoming another emotional weight he carried. So instead, I smiled softly and said, "I'll think about it." But deep down, I already knew I probably wouldn't tell him the full truth. The drive home that afternoon felt longer than usual. Rain blurred softly across the windshield, while old gospel hymns played quietly through the radio speakers. And the whole time, one thought repeated itself inside my mind. "Please, Lord, let me remain strong a little longer." Not for myself, for Ethan. Because mothers never really stop trying to protect their children from pain. Even when those children are grown men. The weeks after my diagnosis passed quietly. Outwardly, very little changed. I still attended Cedar Hill Baptist every Sunday morning, still watered the flowers beside the porch, still folded laundry while soft music played through the house. But privately, Everything felt different. Every staircase climbed more slowly. Every wave of exhaustion was noticed more carefully. And every night before bed, I sat a little longer beside the window, praying. One evening, Ethan called while I was resting in the living room chair. Hearing his voice instantly warmed the house. "Hey, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart." He sounded tired. Work stress again. Deadlines. Meetings. Long hours. I listened quietly while he talked. And several times during that conversation, I almost told him, almost said, "Ethan, I've been sick." But every time the words rose inside me, I swallowed them back down. Because his voice already carried enough heaviness. And mothers noticed that. Instead, would tell my son everything, he answered. "I guess I learned that from you." That sentence stayed with me long after we hung up, because children often inherit silent burdens without realizing it. As winter slowly turned toward spring, my strength continued fading little by little. Nothing dramatic, just small losses. I stopped gardening as often. Church friends began offering rides without directly mentioning concern. Even climbing the stairs to Ethan's old bedroom left me breathless sometimes. Still, I told almost no one the full truth, especially not Ethan. One rainy afternoon, my neighbor, Evelyn, stopped by unexpectedly, carrying homemade soup. "You've looked tired lately," she said gently while placing containers in my kitchen. I smiled softly. "Just getting older." But Evelyn studied me carefully for a moment, then quietly asked, "Have you told Ethan?" I looked down at my hands immediately. "No." She sighed softly. "Margaret, but—" I shook my head before she could continue. "He's already carrying enough." The kitchen remained silent for several moments after that. Then Evelyn whispered gently, "You know, sometimes children deserve the chance to show up before it's too late." Those words unsettled me deeply, not because she was wrong, but because somewhere inside I feared she might be right. That night, I sat alone beside the fireplace, holding the old family Bible in my lap. The hidden letter still rested between the Psalms, unread, unknown. And quietly, I whispered a prayer through tears. "Lord, I don't want my son remembering me as another responsibility he couldn't manage well enough." The room stayed still around me afterward. Only the soft crackling of firewood breaks the silence. Then, softly, almost like an answer, a thought settled inside my spirit. Love is not a burden. I closed my eyes, hearing that. Because somewhere along the way, I had begun protecting Ethan so fiercely from guilt that I also protected him from honesty. And sometimes, silence can wound relationships just as deeply as distance can. A few weeks later, I experienced another dizzy spell while grocery shopping downtown. This one is stronger. For a frightening moment, the shelves blurred around me, and I nearly collapsed beside the produce section. A young cashier rushed over immediately. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I nodded quickly, even though my hands trembled badly. "I'm fine." But truthfully, I no longer was. That evening, for the first time, I pulled out my phone, intending to call Ethan. I even dialed half the number, then stopped, because suddenly, I pictured his face tightening with worry hundreds of miles away. I imagined him blaming himself for not visiting more often. And once again, I chose silence. Not because I didn't want my son, but because mothers often mistake self-sacrifice for protection. Looking back now, That may have been my greatest mistake of all. As spring deepened around Asheville, the dogwoods bloomed softly across Magnolia Street. Church bells continued ringing every Sunday morning. And inside the little white house near Cedar Hill Church, I kept growing weaker quietly, still smiling during phone calls, still saying, "I'm doing just fine, sweetheart." Even when I wasn't, because love sometimes becomes so gentle, it starts disappearing behind silence entirely. And at the time, I still believed there would be another visit, another Christmas, another chance to tell Ethan the truth, slowly and carefully someday. I didn't yet realize that life had already begun running out of tomorrows much faster than either of us understood. For months, I kept my illness hidden because I thought protecting my son from pain was the loving thing to do. But I didn't yet know that one rainy morning soon, a stranger's voice on the telephone. I never did. And by then, the little white house near Cedar Hill Church would already be unbearably quiet. There are certain phone calls in life that divides everything into before and after. Before the call, life still feels ordinary. You still believe there will be more time, more conversations, more chances to say the things you keep postponing. But after the call, nothing ever feels quite the same again. The morning it happened, rain fell softly over Chicago. Gray clouds hung low between the buildings outside Ethan's apartment window. Traffic moved slowly below the streets, while coffee brewed quietly in the kitchen. It was an ordinary Tuesday. At least, it began that way. Ethan had barely slept the night before. Work deadlines, stress, the kind of exhaustion that settles deep behind a person's eyes after too many years of carrying life too fast. His phone had buzzed twice during the night, but he ignored it both times, assuming it was another work email. By morning, the rain outside had grown heavier. Ethan stood near the kitchen counter, tightening his tie while reading messages on his laptop screen. And somewhere beneath all the routine noise of his life, there was still a voicemail from Asheville waiting to be heard. At 8:17 a.m., his phone rang again. This time, the number looked unfamiliar. North Carolina area code. For a moment, he almost let it go to voicemail. But something stopped him. Something small, quiet, the kind of instinct people only understand afterward. He answered distractedly. "Hello." There was a pause on the other end. Then a gentle, unfamiliar voice spoke carefully. "Is this Ethan Whitmore?" "Yes." Another pause. "My name is Evelyn Parker. I'm a neighbor of your mother's." The moment he heard those words, something inside his chest tightened instantly. Ethan straightened slowly beside the counter. What happened? Outside, rainwater slid heavily down the apartment windows. And suddenly, the entire room felt painfully still. Evelyn's voice softened further. "Your mother collapsed early this morning." Silence. Complete silence. Ethan gripped the edge of the counter so tightly his knuckles turned pale. "What do you mean, collapsed?" "She was taken to Asheville Memorial during the night." His breathing changed immediately. Fast and uneven. "When?" he whispered. "Around 2 in the morning." 2 in the morning. While he slept, while work emails waited unanswered. while life continued normally hundreds of miles away. His mother had been fighting for breath alone. The thought hit him like ice. Why didn't anyone call me sooner? Evelyn hesitated softly. Margaret didn't want anyone worrying you. Those words broke something open inside him instantly. Because suddenly, every missed phone call, every postponed visit, every rushed conversation rose painfully into his mind all at once. "Is she okay?" he asked quickly. The silence before Evelyn answered lasted only seconds, but it felt endless. "She's alive," she said gently. "But Ethan..." Her voice trembled slightly then. "You should come home." Home? The word shattered him completely. Because suddenly, Chicago no longer felt important. The meetings, the deadlines, the endless busy life he'd spent years prioritizing. None of it mattered anymore. Only his mother, only time, and deep inside, fear had already begun whispering something unbearable. "You waited too long." The flight from Chicago to Asheville blurred together afterward. Airports, rain, announcements echoing through terminals. Ethan barely remembered any of it clearly. Only fragments. He was shaking his hands while booking tickets. The way his chest tightened every time his phone buzzed. And the terrible thought repeating itself over and over. Why didn't I call more? At one point during the flights, he stared out the airplane window into thick gray clouds while memories flooded him unexpectedly. His mother was waiting at the front door during Christmas break. Her voice said, "Call me when you land." The smell of cinnamon in the kitchen during winter mornings. Ordinary memories. The kind people assume will always remain accessible later. Until suddenly, later no longer feels guaranteed. By the time Ethan arrived in Asheville, the evening had already begun settling over the mountains. Rain still fell softly across Magnolia Street as the taxi pulled toward the little white house near Cedar Hill Church. And seeing it again nearly took his breath away. The porch light still glowed warmly near the front steps. The flower beds his mother loved still lined the walkway. Everything looked the same. And somehow, that made the fear worse. Because life outside the house had continued normally. While inside it, everything had already changed. Evelyn opened the front door before Ethan even knocked. Her eyes looked tired, red from crying. "Oh, Ethan." He hugged her briefly, barely able to speak. "Where is she?" Evelyn lowered her eyes softly. "At the hospital." Then, after a pause, "She's been asking for you." Those words nearly undid him. Because suddenly, all the years of distance between them collapsed into one terrible realization. His mother had still been waiting for him emotionally all along. The drive to Asheville Memorial felt endless. Streetlights blurred through the rain across the windows while Ethan sat silently beside Evelyn, gripping his phone tightly. His mind replayed memories nonstop. Missed holidays, shortened phone calls, promises to visit soon. And beneath every memory, the same painful truth remained. He had believed there would always be more time. When they finally reached the hospital, the smell of antiseptic and soft fluorescent lighting hit him immediately. Nurses moved quietly through the halls. Machines beeped faintly in distant rooms. And suddenly, Ethan felt afraid in a way he hadn't experienced since childhood. A nurse guided him softly toward Margaret's room. His steps slowed near the doorway, because part of him feared what he might see, and another part feared something even worse, that he had arrived too late emotionally, even if technically she was still alive. When he finally stepped inside the room, the sight nearly shattered him. Margaret looked smaller somehow, lying there beneath pale hospital blankets. Fragile, the oxygen tube is beneath her nose, the faint rise and fall of her breathing. And yet, even then, she still looked peaceful, soft, and like the same mother who once prayed over him before school mornings long ago. For several seconds, Ethan could not move, could not speak. Then finally, Margaret opened her eyes slowly, and when she saw him standing there, a faint, tired smile touched her face. Ethan. His name sounded weak in her voice, but full of love, the kind of love that survives distance, silence, and years apart. And suddenly, Ethan broke completely. He moved quickly beside the bed and took her hand carefully. "I'm here, Mom." His voice cracked immediately. "I'm so sorry." Tears slid down his face openly now. Not polite tears, not controlled ones, just grief, regret, love arriving too late to undo years already gone. Margaret squeezed his hand weakly, and softly, through exhausted breath, she whispered, "You came home." Those 3 words destroyed him more than anything else, because there was no anger in them, no accusation, only relief. The quiet relief of a mother who had waited far too long for closeness to return. Ethan lowered his head beside the bed and cried silently while holding her hand. And for the first time in years, nothing in his life mattered more than being beside her. Not work, not successful, not the endless distractions he once thought were urgent. Only this moment, only her, only love. But somewhere deep inside, fear still whispered painfully. What if healing came too late? That night, while rain continued falling softly outside Asheville Memorial, Ethan sat beside his mother's hospital bed, listening to the slow rhythm of her breathing. And quietly, for the very first time, he began to understand the full weight of all the years she had spent loving him silently from a distance. Years he could never get back. Sitting beside my mother's hospital bed that night, I thought I still had time to repair everything between us. I didn't yet know that after she was gone, I would return alone to the little white house near Cedar Hill Church, and hidden inside her old family Bible, I would finally discover the letter she never had the heart to send. Grief changes the sound of a house. Even familiar rooms begin feeling different after someone is gone. Quieter, heavier somehow, like the walls themselves. 3 days after Margaret's funeral, the little white house near Cedar Hill Church sat wrapped in silence once again. Rain clouds drifted slowly over Asheville. The funeral flowers still rested across the dining room table. Half-empty casserole dishes lined the kitchen counters, and everywhere Ethan looked, there were traces of his mother. Reading glasses were beside the lamp. Her sweater folded neatly over the armchair. The faint smell of lavender still lingered softly through the hallway. The house no longer felt abandoned. It felt paused, as though part of it still expected Margaret to walk slowly out of the kitchen carrying tea and smiling gently. Ethan had barely slept since arriving in Asheville. The exhaustion inside him felt deeper than physical tiredness. It was grief tangled together with regret, and regret is a painful thing to carry after someone can no longer hear your apology. That afternoon, he moved slowly through the living room, gathering some of Margaret's belongings into small boxes. Not because he was ready. No one is ever truly ready for it. Because grief forces ordinary tasks onto broken hearts anyway. Outside, wind stirred softly through the maple trees near Magnolia Street. Inside the house, the old grandfather clock ticked steadily near the staircase. Every sound felt louder now, more final. At one point, Ethan stopped beside the bookshelf near Thomas's old chair, and there, resting exactly where it always had, it was the brown leather family Bible. The same Bible that his father once read from every Sunday evening. The same Bible Margaret carried faithfully for decades. Ethan picked it up slowly. The leather felt warm beneath his hands, familiar. For a moment, he stood there holding it against his chest, and suddenly, a memory surfaced so clearly it almost hurt. He was 8 years old again. Thunderstorms rattled the windows outside, and Margaret sat beside his bed, reading psalms softly to calm his fears. God is our refuge and strength, she whispered gently. Back then, her voice made everything feel safe. Ethan swallowed hard and sat slowly in Thomas's old chair. The room smelled faintly of dust, coffee, and fireplace smoke. And quietly, he opened the Bible. At first, he wasn't looking for anything specific. Maybe comfort, maybe closeness, maybe simply another piece of his mother still left behind inside the house. He turned several pages carefully. Highlighted verses, old church bulletins tucked between chapters. Then suddenly, something slipped loose from the center of the Bible and fell softly into his lap. Folded pages, yellowed slightly at the edges. Ethan frowned gently and picked them up. And the moment he recognized Margaret's handwriting, his chest tightened painfully. For several seconds, he stared at the folded letter without opening it, almost afraid to. Because deep down, part of him already knew these pages carried something unfinished. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. At the top of the first page, written carefully in blue ink, were the words, "Dear Ethan," and suddenly the moon no longer felt steady beneath him. He lowered his head briefly before continuing. There are some things a mother learns not to say aloud, because love sometimes chooses silence instead of becoming another burden. Ethan covered his mouth instantly. Because even in the first sentence, he heard her gentleness, her carefulness. The same quiet way she spent her whole life protecting him emotionally, even from her own pain. His eyes blurred as he kept reading. I know life became busy. I know adulthood changes people. But sometimes I miss the little boy who once told me everything. A tear slid down Ethan's face slowly, then another. The house remained completely silent around him, except for the ticking clock nearby. For the first time in years, he truly allowed himself to feel the full weight of what distance had done between them. Margaret's words continued softly across the pages. I never wanted you to feel guilty for building your own life. I was proud of you every single day. But some evenings, this house became so quiet I could almost hear the loneliness sitting beside me. Ethan closed his eyes tightly. Because suddenly, every rushed phone call replayed painfully inside his mind. Every time he answered distractedly, every postponed visit, every moment he chose convenience over connection. And through all of it, his mother had continued loving him quietly, without accusation, without bitterness, only ache. He kept reading through tears. The empty chair at Christmas hurt more than I admitted, not because dinner mattered, but because I missed hearing your voice inside this home. Ethan bent forward slowly, then pressing one trembling hand against his forehead. The grief inside him felt unbearable now. Not only grief for losing her, grief for all the years already wasted before loss finally forced honesty into the open. Toward the middle of the letter, Margaret had written something that broke him completely. You never stopped being loved here, Ethan. Even during the years, we slowly stopped knowing how to reach each other. He cried openly then. Alone there beside Thomas's old chair, not controlled tears, not quiet ones. The crying that comes when regret finally reaches the deepest parts of a person's heart, because suddenly he understood something devastating. His mother had not needed perfection from him, only presence, only softness, only time, and he had spent years believing there would always be more of it later. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows while Ethan continued reading every page slowly. Some lines carried warmth, others carried loneliness so tenderly written it hurt to imagine her sitting alone at the kitchen table writing them. Near the end of the letter, Margaret wrote, If you ever read this someday, please don't remember me with guilt, remember me with love. Ethan immediately shook his head through tears, because guilt already flooded every part of him. Then came the final paragraph. And those words stayed with him forever. You were the greatest joy of my life, Ethan. Even during the quiet years, I never stopped thanking God for you. I only prayed that one day we would find our way back to each other completely. By the time he reached the signature at the bottom, his hands were trembling badly. Love always, Mom. The room fell silent again after that. Only rain, only the ticking clock, and one grieving son sitting alone with the words he should have heard years earlier. Ethan pressed the letter carefully against his chest and closed his eyes. And suddenly all the things his mother used to say made painful sense now. Call me when you can, drive safely, Don't work too hard. Those were never small, ordinary phrases. They were love, steady, faithful, waiting quietly beneath every conversation. And he had been too distracted by life to recognize it while she was still alive fully. That realization broke her more than the funeral had, because grief after death is painful. Regret after silence cuts even deeper. The evening light slowly faded across the living room while Ethan sat there rereading the letter again and again. And for the first time in many years, he spoke aloud to the quiet house. "I'm sorry, Mom." His voice cracked completely. "I'm so sorry." But the house remained silent, because some apologies arrive after the person who needed to hear them has been gone. Still, somewhere deep inside, Ethan also felt something else that evening. Not only grief, understanding. For the first time, he truly understood how faithfully his mother had loved him through every season of distance. Not loudly, not demandingly, just patiently, the way only mothers often do. And sitting there beside Thomas's old chair, holding that heavy letter in trembling hands, Ethan realized something heartbreaking. His mother had spent years waiting emotionally for a closeness he kept postponing until later. And now later had run out. Finding the letter shattered Ethan completely. But he didn't yet realize that before leaving Asheville, he would discover one final lesson his mother had quietly spent her whole life trying to teach him, about love, forgiveness, and the terrible cost of waiting too long to come home emotionally. Grief changes people slowly, not all at once. The world continues moving normally around you, while something inside your heart quietly learns how to live without a voice it once depended on. That's how the days after Margaret's funeral felt for Ethan. Slow, heavy, unreal somehow. The little white house near Cedar Hill Church remained still beneath soft spring rain. Neighbors stopped by less often now. The casseroles disappeared from the refrigerator. The sympathy cards became stacked neatly beside the lamp, and little by little, the world expected life to continue. But grief does not follow calendars. Some mornings, Ethan woke in his childhood bedroom, forgetting for half a second what had happened. Then reality returned. His mother was gone, and nothing inside the house felt the same anymore. One early morning, before sunrise, Ethan walked quietly into the kitchen, unable to sleep. The old floor creaked beneath his steps. Coffee still sat in the cabinet exactly where Margaret always kept it. And without thinking, he reached automatically for 2 mugs instead of 1. The mistake stopped him completely. He stared at the second mug in his hand for several long seconds before slowly setting it back down. And suddenly tears filled his eyes again, because grief hides itself inside ordinary moments, the little habits love leaves behind. That morning, rain tapped softly against the windows while Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table, rereading Margaret's letter once more. The pages had already become worn from his hands, unfolding them over and over again. Every sentence carried her voice so clearly, gentle, patient, loving in ways he had not fully appreciated while she was still alive. One line especially stayed with him. "You never stopped being loved here, Ethan. Even during the years we slowly stopped knowing how to reach each other." He read that sentence again quietly, then lowered his head into his hands. Because now he finally understood something painful. His mother had not wanted perfection from him, not constant visits, not endless attention, only connection, only honesty, only presence. And he had spent years postponing those things for later. Later, after work slowed down. Later, after life became less stressful. Later, after the next promotion. But life does not always wait patiently for people to become emotionally ready. Sometimes love leaves first. A few days later, Ethan began sorting through more of Margaret's belongings upstairs. Closets, old drawers. Boxes are stored carefully beneath the bed. Every item carried memory. Church bulletins folded inside books. Birthday cards are saved for decades. Photographs tucked gently into envelopes. Margaret had kept everything. Not because she lived in the past, but because love mattered deeply to her. Inside one small wooden box, Ethan found dozens of folded papers tied neatly with faded blue ribbon, the unsent letters. His chest tightened immediately. Slowly, he untied the ribbon and opened the first page. "Dear Ethan, today the dogwoods bloomed outside your old bedroom window." Another letter said, "I heard a young boy laughing at church this morning and suddenly remembered how loudly you used to sing hymns beside your father." Another read, "Tonight the house felt especially quiet, so I prayed for you longer than usual." Ethan sat silently on the floor, surrounded by years of his mother's unwritten loneliness. And for the first time, he realized just how much love she had continued pouring toward him, even when distance gave her very little in return. No bitterness, no blame, only patience, only faith. That realization humbled him deeply, because somewhere along the way, he had mistaken his mother's silence for emotional strength. But now he understood the truth. Silence had been the language of her sacrifice. One afternoon, Ethan walked slowly through Cedar Hill Cemetery, carrying fresh flowers in his hands. Soft wind moved through through the trees while church bells echoed faintly across Asheville. Margaret's grave rested beside Thomas's beneath a large maple tree near the edge of the hill. The grass still looked newly turned. For several moments, Ethan stood there silently. Then finally, he knelt slowly beside the grave. "I read your letter," he whispered. The wind stirred softly around him, and suddenly words poured out of him that should have been spoken years earlier. "I thought there would always be more time. I thought being busy meant I was still doing life correctly. I didn't realize how far away I had become emotionally." His voice cracked completely then. Tears slipped quietly down his face. "I should have called more. I should have come home more often." The cemetery remained silent except for distant birdsong and wind moving through the trees. Then softly through tears, he whispered the truth that hurt most of all. "You waited for me and I didn't see it." Those words broke something open inside him permanently, because grief changes people, but regret transforms them. Ethan stayed there a long time that afternoon, long enough for sunlight to slowly break through the clouds overhead. And while sitting beside his mother's grave, he finally understood the lesson Margaret had spent her whole life teaching quietly. Love is not measured by grand moments. It lives inside ordinary faithfulness. Phone calls returned, time made for people, listening fully when someone speaks. Love lives in the presence. And the tragedy is most people only understand that after the absence arrives. Before leaving Asheville, Ethan returned one final time to the little white house near Cedar Hill Church. The rooms sat quietly around him. Peaceful somehow now, not empty, just resting. He walked slowly through the living room, gently touching familiar things as he passed. Thomas's old chair, the kitchen table, the framed family photographs lined the hallway. And finally, he stopped beside the porch swing outside. The same swing where he once sat talking with Margaret during warm Carolina evenings long ago. Ethan lowered himself slowly into the seat and closed his eyes. And for a brief moment, he could almost hear her voice beside him again. Soft, warm, "Don't work too hard, sweetheart." A faint smile touched his face through tears. Because now he finally understood those simple words had always meant. Stay connected. Stay soft. Don't lose yourself chasing a life too busy to love people well. The sun slowly lowered behind the trees while evening settled over Magnolia Street. And quietly, Ethan made a promise there on that old porch swing. Not only to remember his mother, but to live differently because of her. To call people while there was still time, to slow down enough to listen fully, to stop postponing love for someday, because someday is never promised. A few weeks later, after returning to Chicago, Ethan placed Margaret's letter inside his own Bible, right between Psalm 34 and Psalm 35, the same place she had hidden it years earlier. And every so often, on quiet evenings when life begins moving too fast again, he opens those pages carefully and rereads her words. Not as punishment, not as guilt, but as a reminder. A reminder that some love remains patient long after being overlooked, and some mothers keep loving quietly until their very last breath. Looking back now, Ethan often thinks about one truth more than anything else. His mother never stopped waiting emotionally for him to come home, even during the silent years, even during the lonely holidays. Even when disappointment became familiar, she waited with faith, with grace, with love, and perhaps that is the deepest kind of love this world will ever know. The kind that stays soft even after being forgotten for too long. So if there is someone you love tonight, call them, visit them, sit beside them fully while you still can. Because one day, the voice you keep meaning to answer later may become a silence you would give anything to hear again. And if this story teaches anything at all, let it be this. Some love waits quietly forever, but forever on earth does not last forever. Somewhere tonight, a mother is waiting beside a quiet phone, hoping her child remembers home. Don't wait until love becomes memory to finally come back emotionally. Did you like the story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can comment on me so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you a lot for listening to the story on my story platform. Please do subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.